The belief that we live in a post-racial society is a driving cause of the very racism we insist ourselves to be innocent of. Morgan Freeman famously said that the best way to end racism is to stop talking about it. This sort of rhetoric has been used to belittle the cries of civil rights and social justice movements for years. This rhetoric is appealing to those in positions of privilege because it's uncomfortable to be made aware of the lasting effects of slavery, or the AIDS crisis, or the fear that women have of being alone at night. Maybe if you stopped talking about it, it would go away. This kind of thinking is analogous to the idea that maybe if you ignored your cancer, it would just clear up. But there are steps that we can take on a personal level to be critical of racism that don't demand you to make any drastic changes to your life. The belief that racism is a thing of the past is the most racist thing one can do. Once you start thinking that racism is over, you stop being conscious towards racist actions. The reason racism persists is because people choose not to be critical of it. This is the nature of privilege. When a 12-year-old black boy, Tamir Rice, is gunned down by law enforcement without so much as a warning, and the response is that he shouldn't have been hanging around that park, that is racism and privilege at work. Racism pulls the dead boy's flaws into the equation, as if having divorced parents warrants an execution. And privilege allows non-black Americans to ignore it completely, because they know that it could never happen to their son. I'm not interested in politics, some say, because the politics of black lives don't affect them. Police brutality of this degree rarely affects white people because across the board, police departments are more white than the populations they serve. To be able to simply ignore the amount of black deaths at the hands of white police officers once every 32 hours as of February 2016 is your privilege. Many people associate racism with the civil rights movement of the 1960s. People today who grew up with anti-racism after-school specials were taught that bad people are racist, instead of being taught to recognize racist behavior in anyone. On December 1st, 2013, the GOP tweeted, "Today we remember Rosa Parks' bold stand and her role in ending racism." It must make the Republicans feel better about their anti-Mexican attitude towards immigration to believe that racism ended with Rosa Parks. If racism ended all those years ago, then clearly it's impossible for them to be racist today. Ignorance of marginalization affects every non-white, non-straight, non-male citizen of the United States. When policymakers, like Republicans, think that racism is over, they stop writing legislation like the Civil Rights Act, because they think there's no problem to be solved. A la Avatar: The Last Airbenders, there is no war in Ba Sing Se. When racism is brushed aside and the affected groups are told to get over it, there is a dehumanizing effect. We are bombarded with images of Nazi concentration camps all through our education, and yet the Rwandan genocide is reduced to a movie you might watch in high school. You'll rarely hear in American history class refer to colonization as genocide or Christopher Columbus as a murderer. Racism is what caused the correlation between wealth and race. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, reparations were not paid to the freed slaves. They were paid to the slave owners for loss of property. Without anything to build from, freed slaves became tenant farmers on the same plantations where they were enslaved. When you can't accumulate or invest wealth, you stay put. This is why Donald Trump was able to make so much money from his small loan of $1 million. It's also why black people can't get over slavery, because they're all still feeling the effects. This affects every person of color who grows up without learning their own history. Instead of speaking on that, I'd like to expand the scope of this point to include my own experiences as a gay teenager. Things like the Lavender Scare, Stonewall, and the AIDS crisis completely eluded me until recently. It is truly disheartening to realize that history, or at least your history class, doesn't care about you. The only way to fight racism is to be conscious and critical of racist actions. You, on a personal level, must decide to be an ally. It's a two-way street. You need to call out racism where you see it, and you need to listen when a person of color tells you that the things you're doing are racist. Recognizing and calling out racism is not a racist thing to do. There's no such thing as reverse racism. When someone tells you your actions are racist, they're telling you that your actions are dehumanizing, hurtful, and that they perpetuate a long history of systematic oppression. It's not for you to say otherwise. No one is saying that you have to go to the next Black Lives Matter rally. All being an ally against racism means is that you react to racism you see in your daily life instead of being complicit in it. When Nicki Minaj's new song comes on the radio and you're singing along, don't sing the N-word. When that show you're only watching because it's on portrays a racist stereotype, change the channel. Boycotts work. The Montgomery bus boycott was one of the most successful protests of the civil rights movement. If the bus company can't get away with allowing racist policies, neither should the CW's The 100. Refusing to partake in racist actions or patronize racist companies sets an example to your peers and other companies that racism will not be tolerated. If you tell your friends to stop using the N-word with an A at the end, they might just listen to you. Whether your tweet comes with the hashtag Black Lives Matter or Heritage Not Hate, we can all agree that racism shouldn't exist. It's not that no one wants a post-racial society. It's just that we must recognize that the conversation about racism is far from over. We can't stop talking about it because that would put an end to the progress. If we can all take steps to personally recognize how our privilege allows us to benefit from racism and other forms of oppression instead of insisting that it has nothing to do with us, then there will be more empathy and understanding in the world. In that same 60 Minutes interview, Morgan Freeman declared that Black history is American history, but those who preach a post-racial society never mention that part. In suggesting that the best way to end racism is to stop talking about it, Morgan Freeman was envisioning a world in which we don't have to make a point of discussing oppression and privilege. He and many others would like to believe that the fight is over, but as long as the Confederate flag is controversial, and as long as there is a struggle between law enforcement and Black communities, as long as there are kids who go through their entire education without learning about the Black Panthers or the AIDS crisis, then we can't just forget about it. Stop making yourself the victim of racism when you are the primary beneficiary.